like the modern era. It's like we've all been told that we can do anything. And that's like, it's actually true and wonderful that that message has been reinforced. I honestly believe that most people can do anything, but a lot of people have interpreted that to mean they can do everything. And that's just not true. Like, there are only so many hours in the day and you have to choose. So it's quite a confronting message, I think, for people who have been kind of, that you can do anything has been drummed into them.
Welcome to the Bountiful podcast, where we explore what it means to live a bountiful life. Today, I'm excited to welcome Rowan Simpson, an entrepreneur, investor, author, and friend to the show, and no relation. Rowan has played pivotal roles in some of New Zealand's most iconic startups, including TradeMe, Xero, Vend, and Timely. Successes he really talks about publicly because he's more focused on the doing than the telling. Beyond his remarkable career, Rowan is passionate about rethinking our approach to failure, uncertainty, and success, concepts he delves into in his upcoming book, How to Be Wrong. For those who have followed Rowan's writing, you'll know that he has a talent for breaking down complex topics into clear, insightful, and often surprising perspectives. In this episode, we'll explore his journey from the startup trenches to his current work with Hoku Group, which encompasses venture investments, philanthropy, and private business. We'll talk about the frameworks that guide his decisions, his philosophy on money and enoughness, and what it means to take responsibility when you have more than you need. Lastly, we'll unpack what it means for Rowan to live a bountiful life and how his experiences might inspire us all. Rowan, welcome to the Bountiful podcast.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Can you please start off by sharing a little bit about your upbringing and background?
Sure. I was born in Wellington and grew up in Island Bay on the south coast of Wellington. I feel like I had a pretty normal background. It certainly felt normal at the time. I'm one of four kids, so the oldest of four. We did a lot of stuff together as a family, the six of us. I guess it's a little bit like a fish not knowing that it lives in water. That was what I thought was pretty normal.
Amazing. And then career-wise, we'll get into it throughout the episode, but so you sort of normal upbringing, lived in Wellington. How did you end up sort of, working in startups? And I don't know, I sort of look at TradeMe, which we can explain what that is to the rest of the world, as like New Zealand's first startup. It probably wasn't, but...
It definitely wasn't. And maybe it was the one that kind of caught people's imagination the most because it was one of the first mega exits, I suppose, when we sold that business. But also before even the sale, we'd grown to be a really recognised national brand. And so it was something that people felt like they knew and maybe paid a bit more attention to the startup aspects of it than might have otherwise been the case.
And so did you go to university?
I did a computer science degree in Wellington at university, and then actually was recruited out of there to a job with what was then called Anderson Consulting, it's now called Accenture. So it was sort of like a paid MBA, really. It was where I learned more of the business side of things. I worked there for about 3 years before I started my own company.
And then started your own company. What was it called and what did it do?
The startup was called flathunt.co.nz, and it was a rental property classified site. It was ultimately acquired by TradeMe and became eventually part of TradeMe Property.
So the TradeMe Property stuff that we see today, the flat sections, that like the genesis was your
I guess so. Yeah, you can draw a line back to that. Sure.
Love that. So we're here on the Bountiful podcast. What does it mean to you to live a bountiful life?
I think the word bountiful, I guess I kind of have the dictionary definition of that. Like I imagine like a fruit bowl kind of overflowing with lots of different varieties of fruit, right? And so I think a bountiful life is one that's full of lots of different experiences. That would be my definition of that. And yet I think there's probably like another whole definition of that, which in some ways to me is kind of more interesting. It's just like the idea of enough rather than more.
Yeah.
And like many years ago, I remember watching a TED talk actually where the speaker said happiness is wanting what you have divided by having what you want.
That would take me a while to process that.
Yeah. I think the natural inclination is to focus on on the bottom part of that equation and try and have more.
Yeah.
And yet, like the much more impactful thing is to focus on the top part of the equation, on wanting what you have.
It's kind of like I learned a while ago, being where you are rather than wishing for where you want to be in the future. I think a lot of people go, I want to be on a beach or something. Then they get to the beach and then they're already thinking about that. I want to be somewhere else
right,
rather than being where they are. I think I'm moving into, or we've talked about it before, I'm trying to focus on less. And also another guest that we had on the show, David Spinks, he has introduced this sort of concept of trying to add space to his life and space to his days rather than this whole culture of more.
Filling every minute.
Which I love.
Yeah, I think I feel like less has had its moment as well recently, where, I guess it's kind of building on this idea of minimalism and kind of shrinking back to the least. Even in startups, you talk about minimal viable products, right? But I don't know, enough feels like the middle ground between less and more in that sense. And yeah, I would say I don't think I necessarily live that very well. Like I am broadly a discontent person who always kind of wants more or wants something to fix. So it's an aspirational statement rather than a philosophy that I feel like I live every day, if you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. How do you see the world? Or do you have a world view?
I invest in startups. So I think that requires you to be an optimistic person at core. And I think I am an optimistic person. I think a lot of people maybe don't perceive me that way. I think the perception I often get reflected back is kind of quite negative and cynical maybe. And I don't really love that description. I would hate to be called cynical. I like to say to people who would accuse me of that I literally invest in companies that don't exist yet and try and help them become something. So, I think that's sort of the opposite of that. And so, on the other hand, I think I'm quite realistic. I think I'm a optimal realist. Like, if you're going to tell me that you believe you can fly, I'll say, that's cool. It would be amazing. Let's talk through the physics.
Yeah. Back to that cynical point. You've kind of answered the question, but I want to drill into it. Do you think it's because you take hard concepts, like a lot of your writing, you've taken like systems and structures and you've really broken it down into like the factual reality of what's going on? Is it kind of like often we romanticize the idea of startups or ecosystems or life or those sorts of things, and do you think you're kind of accused of being cynical because you're just looking at raw facts and like truths and actually speaking the truth rather than kind of sugarcoating it?
Maybe, and this might just be the scientist kind of coming out, but like I like to talk about what is rather than as well as what could be. Like I think it's really easy to get carried away, especially in the startup world. I think this happens a lot. It's really easy to get carried away with what you believe might be true.
Yeah.
And I think that's really useful to have at least one person in the mix who's kind of the gravity and kind of saying, what is actually true right now?
Yeah.
Because that's where we've got to start from.
And we'll get more into that soon. How do you see yourself?
Oh man, I struggle with that. I think I feel like one of my strengths is being able to put myself in other people's shoes. Like I feel like I'm quite good at that. And like even if I think about when I'm working with founders trying to raise money, I often find myself trying to say, like, let's think about this from an investor's perspective, or vice versa, talking to investors saying, like, have you thought about this from a founder's perspective? So I feel like I do that all the time. Like I'm constantly kind of trying to see the world through other people's eyes. And I'm not sure that I'm very good as a result at seeing the world through my own eyes.
And what advice would you give to your 25-year-old self?
Well, this unfortunately dates me, but I was 25 in 2001. It was a really consequential year for me. So that was the year I got married. It's the year I left Trade Me, thinking that Trade Me was probably done to go and live in the UK for a bit. And it's also the year I lost 25 kgs, which is not something I've spoken about a lot, but was a really consequential part of me.
Yep.
And so, I look back on that year quite fondly. Like some really great things happened. I don't know what advice I would give. I think I would probably say something that might sound trite, but we're sort of baked by those experiences. Like, life is quite long. Like, don't waste too much of it, maybe. You know, go and see the world and have those experiences and marry the girl, you know?
Yeah. And you're still married today, so it worked out.
I'm still married. Yeah. Stop eating the McDonald's and drinking the Cokes, maybe.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
Or work it off. Balance, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I exercise to support my eating habit.
Yeah. I still do, so, you know, you win something, you lose.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at your career now. So what was it like working at and investing in iconic companies like Trade Me, Xero, Vend and Timely? And maybe we could give a bit of a, you know, sentence on what they were so that people globally can understand their context.
Yeah, so I mean, if we tackle them chronologically, Trade Me was the first of those companies. So after, I mean, Flathorn was acquired by Trade Me, and I was effectively the first and only engineer at Trade Me when I joined that team. There were 4 of us eventually. It's an online auction site, so the easiest way to describe it to people outside of New Zealand is it's New Zealand's eBay, but also New Zealand's property marketplace, auto marketplace,
Zillow.
jobs. Yeah, right. So, like, you know, what are standalone, you know, consumer web businesses all around the world, and those verticals in New Zealand was kind of done under one umbrella at Trade Me. And yeah, we grew very quickly, like in those initial years, very quickly. I think we went from 10,000 to 100,000 members the first year that I was working there. And, you know, that kind of growth is pretty invigorating when you're part of it, especially in a small team. You get to have lots of experiences that you can't sort of engineer otherwise. We sold it after only 7 years in 2006 for $750 million. So it was a big exit, and you know, the reality was that reflected the size of the business that we'd grown. So,
and doing the maths, you were like early 30s.
But yeah, I turned 30 the year we sold it. So
crazy. And then how did you get into Xero?
So I was at Trade Me for about a year after the sale. And then, yeah, I mean, I knew Rod, who's the founder of Xero. He was on the Trade Me board briefly before it was sold. And so was in conversation with him about what he was doing next, and decided that that would be an exciting team to join at the early stages. It was pre-IPO, so Xero was still just in the very beginning too. There were about 100 customers on launch day
and
at Xero, and I think I was about 6 of those. Xero's online accounting for small businesses.
What was the team size then? So 100 customers.
I think there were about maybe 25 people when I started. There were about 50 people, I think, by the time the IPO happened. Which, yeah, I mean, to put that in context, there were 53 people at Trade Me when we sold it. So that felt like, Xero felt like a really big, ambitious kind of business.
Grown up.
Because of the number of people and the amount of money that was being spent on it, even in those early days.
One of the things I love about Xero was the amount of millionaires that it made by everyone that worked there, that got shares and then IPO'd, and obviously the shares went from being like worth cents and then worth dollars, and then Xero's worth like 26 billion Australian today. Like, that's pretty exciting for anyone, right?
Yeah, and I mean, put aside the money, just the experiences that thousands of people working on that business have had that now recycle into the ecosystem that we'll talk about. Like, that is amazing. But yeah, I mean, there's a few layers to that, right? Like, no one got given shares in the beginning. Like, everybody working there had the opportunity to buy them. But people invested money to buy those shares. And in many cases, they weren't wealthy people, but they've done very well, and that's awesome. And then, you know, as the company grew and it became a publicly listed, successful company, people have had options over many years, and you see that reflected. Like, you see people coming out of Xero with a bit of backing of their own to do whatever they do next, and it's awesome. I love it.
Can we talk about Vend and Timely and sort of the evolution of sort of these early startups and then what that created later on? Yeah,
so I didn't actually work at Xero for too long, and Vend was kind of the first proper investment that I did, I guess. So Xero was kind of this hybrid where I was both an employee and an investor.
Yeah.
But Vend was the first where I kind of, worked with a founder on their venture and became their first investor, effectively, or one of the first investors. So that was born in the case of Vend, and Timely was a couple of years after that. Same deal with Ryan and Scoff and Will at Timely. So they were both SaaS platforms. Vend is a point of sale system for small retailers. Timely is a booking platform for health and beauty businesses.
Yep.
Both of those companies grew to be overnight successes many years later. But I mostly worked on the early stages of those businesses where they were far from that glorious successful mode yet.
I was just having a moment looking at those brand names going like, how cool is it that people listening will have used all of these products but may not have really thought about them being like tiny little companies that people,
Someone
like customers,
started,
also had to take a risk on to use because their products probably weren't where they are today.
I think there were like maybe 6 retailers using Vend when we invested. And like I could name them, like, they were like family pets almost, like they were, we really, we were delighted to have them as customers, in the beginning. That really matters. And I mean, hopefully that's true even as companies grow, but as you get to tens of thousands, it's a different kind of dynamic, but yeah.
Just quickly, can we're sort of hybriding between like our background of very startup-y and then, some listeners' backgrounds of like wanting to understand more of the space, but not necessarily having been exposed to it. So can we break down some of these terms like startup ecosystem, startup scale-up, angel investor?
I mean,
without going on a rant.
even startup is a complicated one. Like I actually like to break startup into 2 parts. There's like what I would call early stage, which is when you haven't really proven anything yet. You're still kind of often trying to build the thing in the first place. Yeah. And then, if you're successful and you get a bit of traction, you sort of transition into this high growth mode. And I think that's probably what most people perceive as startups. But yeah, they're 2 very different things, 2 very different sets of challenges, and they all get grouped under that startup umbrella.
And then what would be the key difference between like a normal business and a startup?
Yeah, well, I think startup is a phase. You shouldn't be a startup for too long. If you're still a startup for too long, then something's not working. So yeah, I guess there's an element of ambition or growth or aspiration kind of baked into that term. Like you want to be something that you're not yet.
Yeah, I like that. And then what is an angel investor?
I would never call myself an angel investor, to be clear. I really don't like that label. But an angel investor is kind of a broad term that's given to people who invest their own money in companies right at that early stage.
What do you call yourself?
I call myself an investor. I feel like that's enough. I don't have wings.
Love it. And then you've kind of explained that. So
an ecosystem?
Yes, startup ecosystem. What is a startup ecosystem?
An ecosystem is just a collection of startups. It's kind of, I think it's easy to overcomplicate it, but it's really just a collection of startups either in one place or in one vertical of types of businesses. Like you might talk about this ecosystem of SaaS startups, for example, or maybe industry verticals. But yeah, it's a sum of the parts.
That's interesting because you only said startups, whereas it doesn't include all of the
support services. Yeah, and I mean, like think of an ecosystem in the natural world, right? Like you think about the trees in the forest. And there's obviously small trees and big trees and everything else, but then there's kind of the surrounding environment that those trees grow in. So there's both of those things are important. If you just have the surrounding environment and no trees, you wouldn't call it an ecosystem.
So I guess we're kind of backdooring into it, but How to Be Wrong is an intriguing title. So you've written a book. Why did you decide to write the book and why now? And then we can explain what the book is about.
Yeah, I mean, all the way through all of these stories I've been writing, like I started a blog when I was running the engineering team at TradeMe. Thought it sort of a thinly disguised excuse to try and tell the TradeMe story a bit better for recruitment. And yeah, I've just sort of kept rolling with it. That blog continued right through to 2015. In 2021, I did the Substack challenge where I tried to publish a post every week for that whole year.
Yeah.
And so I ended up with this big collection of writing, and a few friends basically bullied me into packaging it into a book, to be honest. And it's been a really delightful process because like I use writing as a way of thinking. Like publishing something that lots of people are going to read really forces you to make sure that you believe what you're saying. And I find that a really nice kind of challenging way to kind of form my own thoughts.
Yep.
And so, yeah, doing that in book form is kind of that on steroids because you can start out with this kind of collection of blog posts and essays, you put them all together and like the inconsistencies are quickly highlighted.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's been a really fun process of kind of trying to turn that into a single narrative and try and tell the stories a bit better too. Like I had this repeated experience where through the editing process where I'd sort of share a draft with somebody who knows what they're doing in terms of writing, and they would say, "You're not in this story." Yeah. And so, yeah, like having to tell my own stories in that process has been kind of challenging and fun.
Someone that doesn't like talking about themselves, I can imagine it must have been challenging.
Yeah, but also satisfying.
Yep. And then what is the book about?
I mean, broadly speaking, it's the story of these four companies. So it starts in 99 with Flat Hunt and goes through to 2021 when Vend and Timely both were sold within a few weeks of each other.
Yep.
Both acquired within a few weeks of each other. It's another sort of perspective on that.
Yep.
And yeah, it's kind of all of the things that I learnt along the way. It's easy to paint these four companies especially as these glorious successes.
Yep.
And, you know, that is not the reality. So how to be wrong is kind of, I guess, the meta lesson of those four things is like learning the things that worked, the things that didn't work, the patterns that were able to be repeated. And yeah, trying to share those with people who might be working on their own things now is kind of the whole point.
And then as a teaser, like what were some of those patterns?
I mean, there's heaps of them. And I think the deceit would be to say that there's a silver bullet.
Yep.
Like it's lots of little things that build on each other. And if I try to turn that into a takeaway, if you like, it would be you need to find those things. You need to be looking for those things. And I can tell you what worked in those particular contexts. Yeah. But hopefully the lesson that people really take away from it is kind of go in with that mindset that, you know, while we start out with these big ambitions and future aspirations, probably not right about all those things. And if we can find the ways that we're wrong sooner, we'll be much better for it.
What a mindset as well, because a lot of people like to be right rather than wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of that's what it requires to be a founder. Like you have to have this kind of irrational belief, and that's important. I don't want to discount that. Like I think if most founders knew how hard it was going to be to start up and grow a business, they wouldn't start up and grow a business.
Yep. And
so we're all better off that there's kind of this naivety about that. But at the same time, to be successful, you can't just be ambitious for the future. You have to actually execute in the present as well. And yeah, being realistic about that, it is important as well.
So could you share 2 or 3 key lessons or insights from the book that you think would be valuable for listeners and hopefully encourage them to read the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real themes of the book is that we often attach one name to a successful company, but the reality is there's always a team of 10, sometimes hundreds of people. And so I think one of the repeated patterns across all 4 of those companies, which is interesting, is how important it was the early team and the culture that set. You know, necessarily in the very beginning of a company, you tend to hire people that you know, but also people who are generalists who can do multiple jobs. And yeah, I think looking for a repeated pattern across 4 quite different businesses, that's one. Like, you know, the first handful of people who came into each of those businesses and played critical roles was really important.
Several ways we can go. So basically you're saying that like the lone genius is like kind of important, but also a bit of a myth?
I mean, someone has to be the founder, so let's not discount that. But a lone genius by themselves is a disaster.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like the people that surround that founder in the beginning are critical elements of any success in the end.
And then obviously there's a point at which generalists don't actually cut the mustard anymore as companies grow up, right?
Yeah,
So then what happens then?
Yeah, so I mean, again, that's another repeated pattern that I've written about, which is like these companies tend to break at quite predictable moments.
Like 100 people?
Like 30 people is the first one in my experience. And yeah, like, you know, that's the point where you can't just be like a team of generalists. Like you start to need a bit of structure. And then, yeah, there's another break point at like 120 where you don't know everybody's name all of a sudden. And so, yeah, like if you're aware of those patterns, you can hopefully anticipate them a bit better.
That 120 point, in my experience, is where for founders, the culture is no longer them. It has to be well embedded in the business.
Right. If you haven't baked it in by then, it's too late.
Yeah.
For sure. And yeah, it's starting to be set by a much larger group of people. So you'll get elements of all of that baking in. I mean, the other thing that can happen, and this is certainly true for Vend, is you can go from 30 to 120 very quickly. Yeah. And so if you haven't resolved the brokenness that happens at 30, as you're approaching 120, it can be really challenging.
What is the saying? I loved it back in the day. It was like you can't scale a leaky bucket. And so half of your job is trying to like plug all of the holes so you can like try scale more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. Like it's easy to focus on pouring more water into the top of the bucket, but it's not always the biggest problem that you have or the biggest constraint.
Give me one more lesson or insight that maybe a founder listening to this would be like, oh, I really need to hear that right now. That's very like pivotal to my current stage.
Yeah, good question. There's probably one around capital raising that would be worth discussing, but maybe just as a little tangent for people who aren't kind of soaking in startup jargon.
Yeah.
I mean, these companies necessarily need to raise money, funding. Yep. Like they tend not to be profitable companies, especially when they're in that high growth mode. You're investing in growth ahead of the curve. Yep. And so like there's this constant existential kind of question about where that money's going to come from. And yeah, I think maybe again a kind of repeated pattern across all four of those is if you're good enough, there's capital there available for you. And so it's easy to kind of think that raising money is hard. It is hard, even for the best companies. And it's easy to blame external factors then as sort of give yourself that excuse. But there's actually heaps of money that's out there looking to invest in the best companies, and the challenge is to be good enough.
It's here, right?
Yeah.
Are we good enough?
Yeah, right. And this is, maybe this is why I get called cynical.
Well, you just got to do what you say you will and hit your numbers, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. Yeah, like I think the easiest way to impress a potential investor is what I call scrappy execution. Like especially if they've followed your progress for a while, and you know, if you can go to an investor and say, "Hey, remember when I said we were going to do X? We did X, and now we're going to do Y." It's much easier for them to believe that Y might be possible. Whereas if they've followed your progress and you're out there saying, you know, we're going to do X, and you don't do it, and then you say we're going to do Y, and you don't do it, it's pretty hard to convince them that they should give you money to invest in Z, you know?
What are some more of the like general lessons that you've learned during your time as both an entrepreneur and investor?
I mean, the clue's kind of in the name of the book. Like I've been wrong constantly and repeatedly and sometimes quite expensively throughout that whole time, right? And it's easy to focus on the big wins. But the biggest lessons come from all of those other things, not from the, you know, the press release that happens when a company is sold.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of like don't pretend, I guess, that that's not true, because actually that's the most interesting part the story. And I wish we would tell those stories more. Like, I'm often surprised when I do share some of those real stories of those companies that people are surprised to hear them.
Yep.
And they shouldn't be surprised to hear them, because like every successful company has those stories. It's just we don't tell them very well.
Could we do a generalised, just like jotted the hands without naming names, of like nearly didn't get money at a pivotal juncture, like some of those like kind of train wrecks that they wouldn't have happened?
I mean, I alluded before to 2001 being the year that I moved to London. Like, Trade Me ran out of money. I didn't leave because I was disgruntled.
Yeah.
I left because I'd worked there for a couple of months for no pay.
Yeah.
And they couldn't, that wasn't sustainable. So even Trade Me, which was this like really heralded success, had that period where the company was practically dead. It was being propped up by shareholder loans. And that part of the history is just brushed over so often that I guess others working on their own companies don't get to hear that and don't realise that maybe is more normal than you might otherwise assume.
Yeah. So high growth ventures often involve immense personal sacrifice. What are some of the patterns you've noticed among founders who successfully balance business and life? And I know you might have a problem with balance, but...
I mean, I don't have a problem with balance. I just think it's very difficult to achieve, it would be my observation. Yeah. I think that the founders that we call most successful, by one particular definition of success, but still the ones who get called that, are often very unbalanced. Yep. They're often very focused actually on specific things at the expense of other things. And so, like there is a nice pattern. It's actually Randy Zuckerberg, who's Mark Zuckerberg's sister, that I stole this from, but I'll see if I can remember the 5 things, which she sort of talks about: family, hobbies, sleep, exercise, and work, I think, are the 5. And her little kind of pattern around that was like, choose maybe 2 or 3 out of those 5. And so that would probably be my definition of balance. I don't think I would make it this binary work-life balance. I think if you want to be really successful in your career, probably the best thing to do is surround yourself with unbalanced people who are focused on their career.
Yeah.
And if you want to be successful in your life, you can do the opposite. And neither of those is better than the other, to be clear. But it's okay to choose, and you probably do have to, and focus means saying no. That's a famous Steve Jobs quote, actually. And so thinking through all those other things that you might want to do as well as work, and choosing which ones you're happy to not do in order to focus on the one that you are choosing, is actually kind of the key.
Do you think part of this personal sacrifice is admitting to yourself that you just physically can't do it all if you want to?
I feel like that's maybe the deceit of like the modern era. It's like we've all been told that we can do anything. And that's like, it's actually true and wonderful that that message has been reinforced. I mean, I honestly believe that most people can do anything, but a lot of people have interpreted that to mean they can do everything. And that's just not true. Like, there are only so many hours in the day and you have to choose. So it's quite a confronting message, I think, for people who have been kind of, that you can do anything has been drummed into them.
My one that's kind of been thrown at me a little bit has been like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And I've really wanted to do that. And then I kind of had to have a like come to Shan moment of being like, oh, you actually physically can't do this, or you actually need to just choose.
Yeah, which is, I don't know, maybe the key to that is to glamorize choosing. Like maybe we should put more emphasis on that.
Yep.
It's okay to choose the things that you think are most important out of that bundle of things that you could choose. And it's okay to focus on those too. Like, if you want to be really focused on your business and make that successful, that's okay. Like, it shouldn't be frowned upon, I don't think.
Yep.
In fact, all the people we celebrate are those who have often done exactly that.
Could we just look at some of so still related to this whole personal sacrifice thing, are there any like do's and don'ts, small habits maybe, that people kind of did or didn't do and that you think helped or didn't help?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you one example from the book if it's useful, which actually got turned into a little app at one point called Top 3. And so the idea is before you go to bed, write down the top 3 things that you want to focus on the next day. And then the next day, do those things first. It's kind of like the simplest productivity system you could possibly imagine, but also the most soul destroying from personal experience when you try it, because in my case, at least, you quickly discover that many days you do 0 out of 3. Like you've filled your day still. It's not like there were not enough hours. So yeah, like as a little mental model, I really love that one. It's kind of like, everyone can, if you press them, everyone can come up with what their top 3 priorities are. It's like, cool, well, why don't you do those things first? Like, why not? Is kind of a challenging question to have to confront. And yeah, especially if someone's telling you that they don't have enough time or they are too busy or something else, you can say, well, cool, what are the top 3? Why aren't you doing those first?
In your experience, what makes for high-performing teams effective board members and outstanding operators?
Oh, effective board members is an interesting one in that list. I have been a board member of a couple of startups. I think the role of the board is kind of misunderstood often. Like startups, unlike more mature businesses, don't tend to have governance problems. The fact that your risk matrix is not perfectly well documented is probably not the thing that's holding you back, but they all have strategy problems. And so, I think my advice to founders around that would be to try and prioritize people who can really help develop your thinking on that and hold you to account on that, rather than someone who's going to, bring a more traditional governance mindset to it. In terms of high-performing teams, I mean, it's always coming and going, like especially in these companies which are fast changing. Like every person in that team will have a phase of that which suits them, and sometimes that will come and go, and that's okay. So there's ebbs and flows within all of that. But yeah, I mean, I think there are some really sort of fundamental elements of that, like as much as is possible, being transparent within yourselves about how things are currently going. I think that's a pretty important piece, and being realistic about that. I think there's lots of little tricks you can use too to kind of depower mistakes. If you're going to sort of adopt this mindset of we're probably wrong and let's work out as quickly as possible what that is, then like baking that into your culture so that it's not too traumatic where someone does make mistakes, I think is important too.
I really like that phrase, depower a mistake. What does that look like in practice? Something doesn't go right, you look at it and you're like, is it kind of like a post-mortem on the mistake kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, really high-performing teams are really good at reviewing and debriefing, and actually also pre-briefing, like how things might go wrong. And that's a real learned behaviour. But I'll give you a little silly example. At TradeMe, we used to have this thing called the Turkey Award, which was actually a rubber chicken. We never really resolved the difference between the name and the object, but it would basically be handed round to whomever had made the silliest mistake in the last week or whatever it had been since we met. It was a really nice way of bringing those things to the surface, so they were talked about. They weren't kind of brushed under the carpet, but also just kind of, I guess depowering is the best way I can describe it. Like they weren't, those weren't career limiting mistakes. You're able to kind of say, I messed that up.
Oops.
That was dumb. And maybe sort of by osmosis, people start to pick up the some of the causes and some of the ways that you react to that. I think that for me, that's kind of all part and parcel of a high-performing culture.
I really like that.
I think the failure mode version of that is where people are too scared to say something's not working. It's kind of the emperor's new clothes kind of scenario. And that cycles towards real failure real quick.
What are the qualities of an ideal founder?
So, I mean, we talked briefly about this before. I think it's a bipolar role. Like you have to believe in a future that doesn't exist yet and be able to articulate that. And yeah, you have to be able to kind of drive towards that despite the evidence in the beginning. So yeah, I think most of the founders that I've worked with who are great have both of those elements to some greater or lesser extent.
Is that something that people can grow into or develop, or do you think they kind of just have to have it?
I mean, most of the founders that I've worked with have had other roles previously, like they've come from some background.
Yeah.
I don't think you're necessarily born a founder, if that's what you mean by the question.
No, I mean like that, having a lens on the future, but having to drive towards it. Like, is that a muscle you can?
Yeah, but I think it's also a dangerous muscle because it's pretty easy to get high on your own supply in that mode, right? Like that you have to. I think you have to kind of in your heart believe that that's possible, and it's useful to have other people around you who, from time to time, say, also gravity.
Yeah.
Occasionally you come across people who want to be entrepreneurs, and I always wonder what that means. And there's a real distinction in my mind between a founder and an entrepreneur, whereas an entrepreneur kind of thinks that they want to work on a business.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when you really dig at that, they don't know yet what that is. Yeah. And they kind of are open to what that might be. Whereas I think when you find a really great founder, they generally have like this deep discontent about some particular thing that really bugs them and that they want to fix or they want to improve or they want to do differently. And yeah, those are like very different mindsets, I think, for me.
You have a framework that I know. Do you want to talk about what your framework is that sort of gravity is a part of?
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the 3 perspectives?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's 3 really interesting ways to kind of think about how something is going currently. If you think about it as having 2 dimensions, like on one dimension is kind of objective versus subjective. So like data, numbers, facts, metrics, those are kind of, the empirical reality. Yeah. And that's important. It's important to be able to measure that and know what that is and be honest about that. In many ways, though, the other 2 perspectives, which are the subjective perspectives, are the more useful, I think, especially for founders, because if you're a founder, if you're working in an early stage team, there's often not great numbers to make you feel good. It's quite a subjective kind of assessment. And yeah, you can split that into 2 bits. Like that's the other dimension is kind of like internal versus external. And so like there's no dimensions to numbers, they're just numbers. But when you think about subjective, like how does it feel, you have to kind of split that into a brutal honesty in yourself about how it's going. And I think even the most kind of, bombastic founder still really benefits from having those quiet moments where they kind of reflect and say, this is how it's actually going. I know I'm saying this out loud, but this is how it actually feels. And then there's an external perspective of that too, like an external subjective perspective on how things are going is really useful. And like having people in your orbit who can provide that, who have just enough distance from it that they're able to be, they're able to see it for a start, but also who you trust enough to be able to say, when they say, hey, I noticed this, that you really pay attention to that. Yeah. I think that's actually one of the keys to success.
Gravity. For some reason, you made me think of something just then that maybe I want to share, which is around, it's kind of about that internal, external perspective, I think. I have been having a lot of issues with my sleep lately, and part of it, I think, is because I don't have a practice in my day where I'm having that conversation with myself about the stuff that's actually on my mind. Because the day is like quite busy, and then I kind of just need, and then I'm thinking about that stuff when I go to sleep.
Yeah.
And I was like, ideally you would have had this kind of thought process during the day so that it wasn't the stuff you were thinking about when you were sleeping. And so I think I'm going to build into my days just about half an hour where I kind of do a bit of a self check-in. That sounds like a very formal term, but where it's just
No. I mean,
process.
there's heaps of little models you can use for that too. And I don't know that there's a right or a wrong one. It's probably the one that you're able to remember and actually use that will be most valuable. But yeah, like one I used to use with Vaughan was kind of, what are we doing? What are we not doing? What could we do differently? Yeah. And like, you just kind of have to lock yourself in that little space and just run through those questions in your head, and inevitably you come out with a page of notes, you know. And yeah, it's really useful kind of internal subjective assessment.
At Kiwi Landing Pad, we used to use this, like, I found it pretty brutal at the time, but it was honest, which was like, who cares, what matters, and compared to what.
Right. I mean, this is a great example. I love that framework too. Yeah. And there's lots of those kind of frameworks, right? It doesn't matter, I don't think, which one you choose. So much more important that you choose one and you just use it methodically and see if it works.
I would like to talk a little bit about money and meaning. And hopefully you'll answer my questions. So you've achieved significant financial success. How has your relationship with money evolved over time?
Oh, yeah, really good question. It's probably hard for me to remember how I thought about money previously. But, I mean, go back to university, you asked right at the beginning about that. Like, I was very motivated when I was a student to not be paying student fees anymore and to have some money of my own. And, you know, so I did a 3-year degree and then got a job as quickly as I could. Yeah. So yeah, I do. I mean, I come from that kind of perspective where I felt like money was going to create a lot of opportunity and freedom, and it does. So, I mean, I don't know if that sort of answers the question, but yeah, like I think it's kind of back to your question around bountiful life as well. Like, there's always more. Like, there's always a bigger boat, there's a bigger house. You know, if you're the sort of person who's motivated by that aspect of money, I think you're going to be chasing that your whole life. Yeah, and I mean, like, you know, let's get our tiny violins out. It's kind of, you know, the work of managing money once you've got it is a serious first world problem. Yeah. But it's still work. Like it's yeah, I mean, I like to say having money is great because you don't have to worry about money anymore. You've got more time to worry about everything else. Yeah.
Still got all the other problems. Yeah. Or a lot of them. What does enough mean to you?
Enough money?
Enough in general.
Enough full stop.
I guess the money funds some of the stuff that means enough, but no.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a bit when we were talking about founders about that kind of discontent. Like, I think discontent ultimately drives a lot of good outcomes for startup companies, especially, like seeing something that could be different and better. Yep. And so enough probably means that you've dialed down the discontent enough that that's no longer like the dominant voice in your head. Yep. And I won't pretend that that's my reality very often, but certainly having more money has allowed that to be more frequent, yeah.
You'll love this next question. How do you balance ambition with contentment?
Oh, man, I think ambition is a really complicated word. You've had Julie on this podcast.
I was like, our friend Julie Fry would agree.
Yeah. I mean, she wrote a whole book with Hayden about this, and I think it's great that different people have very different definitions of that. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like being a generally discontent person has served me really well. I wonder whether it's one of those things where your biggest strength is also your biggest weakness. And actually, if you tried to flip discontent into contentedness, you might take away all the good bits as well as some of the bad bits.
I think your discontent is my why. Like, when I was little, I was always like, why? And if an adult gave me a stupid answer, like, just because, I would get really discontent with that answer because I knew it wasn't an answer. It's like, that's something you said. It's actually not the reason why. And so truly, I can only be content with an answer a lot of the time if it's actually the answer. Another cheeky question, is the grass really greener on the other side?
I think the best way I can summarize is I have that expression that having lots of money is great because it means you don't have to worry about money. It means you have more time to worry about everything else.
Yeah.
And so, I guess that particular aspect of the grass is greener.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's only one small aspect of what makes for a bountiful life, to use your expression. And so, I think if you're fixated on that, it's kind of sad.
Yeah.
I think there's many other dimensions, and for a lot of those dimensions, money actually doesn't make much difference at all. Like, if you think about family, if you think about friendships, if you think about physical health, mental health.
It almost does the inverse in a way.
I think that's possibly true, yeah. So if you're over-indexing on that, the grass might seem like it's greener, but it's probably not very healthy to eat for you. I don't know. Are we both cows in this metaphor now?
If you want to be. How do you stay grounded?
I have 2 teenagers, or actually one's actually now older than a teenager, and throughout the time, our youngest was born shortly before Trade Me was sold. Throughout that time of having business success and the money that came with it and what have you, I've also gone home and been a dad and all those things, and that you pretty quickly get put in your place.
Changing diapers, you're up at all hours?
All of those things, but more importantly, they don't care. They don't care that you run a successful team or that you've sold companies for lots of money. All those things, the things they care about, are very different, and so I think that's very grounding.
I think that people who don't have resources or money think about life when they have it, but we don't necessarily often hear about that when you do have resources or means, you actually do have a responsibility to kind of make change in the world in a way.
Yeah. And I think it probably would be easy to over-glamorize that, but it ultimately boils down to just investing. I think broadly, as a society, we're not great at investing in things. And so, it's one of the great things that you get to do when you have that sort of financial position, is you get to invest in things. And that could be everything from young companies like we invest in. It could be in much more boring kind of types of investments, but which actually do drive real change for people, all the way through to, at the philanthropic end, we've put a ton of money into that, and that's very satisfying work, but it's ultimately just an investment as well. It either creates good outcomes or it doesn't. And so the work of choosing those things is it's kind of part of the satisfaction of being able to invest those.
Last question in this section. You're one of the hardest working people I know. Why do you still work when you don't need to?
Yeah, good question. I get this a lot from my family too. I think it's probably kind of a core part of my personality. And I also kind of love it. Which is not to say that I love every moment of it.
Who does?
No, but I do find a lot of the work that I do really satisfying. So I don't actually feel like I've worked for a long time. I am basically unemployable by somebody else. So I'm choosing to do everything that I'm doing. And I think the other good reason is that I'm not very good at golf. And it's kind of weird, especially, you said before I was 30 when we sold Trade Me. It's even All Blacks are not retired at 30. So
we have some listener questions.
Oh, goodness.
I'm going to go through them quickly. What is holding New Zealand's startup ecosystem back, in your opinion?
What's the constraint? Oh, very good question. This is one of my favourite questions to ask founders is, what's the biggest constraint? So let me answer with what most people believe, and then I'll answer with what I think is true.
Sure.
For a long time, we've believed that the thing holding us back is capital, lack of capital. And I do not believe that, and I've sort of argued against that for a long time. I think the biggest constraint is very clear, which is number of people. Like we're a very underpopulated island, and yeah, like the biggest negative tell that I have about the ecosystem in New Zealand is when people are poached from one startup company to another.
Yeah.
It's like when we're starting to do that, that really highlights the actual constraint, I think.
Yeah. You said in the start of our chat, which is like the biggest constraint of companies is people. And then to add to that, I think it's actually finding the right people at the right time that you actually need them as this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the things I think is that there's kind of a clutch answer to that too around like the pipeline for engineers, for example. So that's something that gets a lot of attention, especially from politicians. And yet, like, we're really desperately short of great salespeople in New Zealand. Like, most of the startups that I work with have good engineers, but all of them could do with more experienced salespeople.
Yep.
And like New Zealanders culturally are not great at that kind of sales on a global sense. So, like there's a massive shortage of that particular skill set within those companies.
What advice do you have for how to successfully support other startups? A lot of people mean well, but how do you actually add value consistently? And maybe we could frame this two ways. One is in the context of like generally, two would be in the context of maybe a founder spinning out, maybe has taken some money off the table and then can now channel that, because those are two very different examples, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think the second part of that question is quite easy. Like if you're someone who's come out of a successful company with experience, probably most importantly, and maybe a bit of capital, like both of those things can be recycled really readily. Like you shouldn't have to work too hard. And there's lots of different ways that could be. Like you could be everything from a founder yourselves if you want to go again, all the way through to, you know, a passive investor even is sometimes really valuable, especially if it brings with it some experience.
Yep.
And I don't think that there's right or wrong answers. Like people need to choose what they think will be the biggest contribution. And yeah, like flip it around too. Like what's the expertise that you can apply to those companies? Like there's different, like we talked about before, there's hundreds of different roles within these businesses. And you know, like if you've come out of a company and you were in a people and culture role, for example, guaranteed there are other companies now trying to solve the problems that you solved in that capacity in your successful role.
Yep.
And so just be aware and look out for those, and you might get sucked into one of them, or even if it's just like much sort of less formal, kind of sharing your perspectives. One of the three perspectives is an external one, right?
Whoa. Bonus question, have to ask, because I know you have thoughts on this. Founders get a shitload of advice. And so do you have a framework or just advice on advice?
Meta,
advice on how they can synthesize what is the right advice for them, how to take it, and like kind of the impact on that advice?
Yeah.
That they're taking?
So John, who used to work with closely, basically taught me the best framework I have for this, which is the difference between advice and perspective. So like advice, you might need to school me on exactly what this was, because you probably heard it from him many more times than I did. But like everybody can provide a perspective, but you need to, when you're receiving those perspectives, you can kind of depower them a little bit by saying, yeah, they're perspectives from where they're standing, looking in.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it comes back to that quiet moment we were talking about before. I think you have to I think you should have your ears open to perspectives whenever you can get it. I think most founders will feel like they're inundated by advice, but they're definitely not inundated by good advice.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a filtering process. But if you just shut yourself off to that, you're going to shut yourself off to potentially really valuable things too. Yeah, it's a weird kind of, again, a bipolar thing that you have to kind of have confidence in yourself and what you think, but to kind of constantly question that based on the perspectives that you're getting.
Another thing that John taught me was just around like trust and credibility. And so it's a funnel, and at the top you've got trust and credibility, and I guess at the bottleneck of the funnel is the problem or the advice that you want. And then you go, do I trust the person? Yes, potentially. Are they credible against the problem I'm trying to solve? Like, possibly not. And so then it filters the advice through the funnel. And so if you get someone that's both you trust and that has credible advice against the problem, sure, you might take them their advice.
Yeah.
And so the thing, I think I was buying shoes, and he was like, you trust me, but I have no idea about women's shoes. I'm not a woman.
Right.
So therefore, maybe don't take my advice.
Right.
And I was like, great example.
Yeah, it is a good example. I think one thing that happens a lot is people give advice based on their own experience. And so you have to filter based on that as well. Yeah. So one of the things I remember getting really frustrated by shortly after Trade Me, like I guess in the era where I was at Xero, and then shortly after, a lot of people would hit me up and want to know the exact pattern that we'd used at Trade Me. Like, how did you solve this particular engineering thing, or how was the database structured, or how did you, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And eventually got so fed up with those things, I would just say it's irrelevant. Like the way we did it 5 years ago is actually irrelevant. And also it doesn't help you for me to give you the exact thing that we did. Like the reason that we were successful is we thought about it and settled on an approach that was appropriate for us at that time in that place. And so it's more interesting to kind of coach you around, why aren't you doing that thinking yourself?
It's provocative, isn't it? Quick fire questions.
Okay.
What, in your opinion, is the most underrated fruit or vegetable?
I mean, I have to say feijoa. We live on a feijoa orchard. We planted about 2,500 feijoa trees about 12 years ago. And that's one of the things that I get to look at every day.
Do you supply all of New Zealand's feijoas?
Actually, no. I mean, we pick a lot of feijoas, but mostly it supplies South Island supermarkets. So.
Worst meal your parents made you eat?
I think that's a complicated one. I mean, there's a good chance my mum will listen to this because she supports all my work.
Sorry, Mum. Okay, now what's the answer?
Well, here's one thing I guess that I only really realised when I became a parent myself and saw the way that Emily, my wife, approached family meals. One of the things which wasn't a useful habit that we developed when we were kids was that bad food was a treat. So like we didn't used to eat out a lot, but like as a treat we would get McDonald's or something like that. And so like the mental association of that probably would be my answer to that question. Yeah.
What are you most proud of?
It's probably a recency bias, but at the start of this year I did the Coast to Coast race.
Cool.
Which was this like massive physical, mental, kind of emotional challenge. And it's one of the most satisfying things that I've done recently.
For people who don't know what that is, do you want to just give a quick, like, how long it is and what you're actually doing?
Yeah, so it's a completely mental multi-sport race from one side of the South Island to the other side of the South Island.
In New Zealand?
In New Zealand. Yep. You can do it, in, like the really crazy athletes do it in one day, but I did the 2-day version. So it's a mixture of running, road cycling, mountain running, scrambling, right over the main pass in the South Island. And then, in the second day, kayaking down quite a challenging river, actually. So
rapids?
That was, lots of rapids. And that was a brand new skill for me. So it was actually, learning a new skill like that at my age felt really good. Yep. And it was, like finishing that race, I was completely physically done.
We call that pooped.
Yeah. I was going to say knackered, but...
delightfully pooped.
Yeah. But there's quite a cool photo of me coming down the finishing chute where I'm just kind of like, but it felt really good, especially that second day on the kayak to stay dry.
Oh, good job. Do you have any tenets that you live by?
Like mantras?
Yeah. Principles?
Yeah, maybe. It's kind of what I said before when you asked me about the advice for 25-year-old. I think it's really common for people to say life is short. But I quite like to say life is long. Yeah. And then think about where that takes you.
What is something that you thought mattered but realised that it actually didn't?
Okay, so go back to when I was at university.
Yeah.
Like I worked really hard at university and got really good grades, and I thought that was the important thing.
Yeah.
And I remember the job interview I did at the end, and I was sort of prepared for kind of quite a, I guess, technical interview. And I came out of that interview thinking that I'd completely blown it, because all they wanted to talk about were things like, when I was at secondary school, I did schools debating, for example, and they just wanted to talk about that, or the rugby team that I had captained. And I sort of came out thinking, oh man, like I worked 3 years to get these really great grades and they didn't even care. And actually the things that mattered for that job were all of the other things that wrapped around it. Like those grades were table stakes.
Yeah.
And, being able to sort of have a heads up perspective of the world was the thing that they were actually looking for. So
Rowan, thank you for sharing your journey and insights with the Bountiful podcast today. For our listeners eager to dive deeper into Rowan's work and obviously to read his book, I'll put all of the links in the show notes and on our website. If today's episode resonated with you and left you inspired, don't forget to follow and subscribe for more enriching conversations. Our season is filled with extraordinary guests from diverse backgrounds, all contributing to our understanding of what it means to live a bountiful life. So thank you so much.
thanks for having me, Sean.
And thanks for tuning in. Bye for now.